you hear me? It's better? Is near my mouth. Oh. Is that good? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So it's a macroeconomic multisectoral model of neo-Keynesian inspiration. It is comparable to models used in quarterly forecasting, as an example, comparable to the Mésange model, which has been built by the finance ministry in France. Versions have been developed for France, Mexico, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. It's a model which is shared with the French Energy Ministry and soon by the Finance Ministry. It's important to have a sectoral disaggregation. So we have 37 sectors with a focus on energy, with 17 subsectors. This allows us to analyze the effect of transfer of activities from one sector to another. It's important because sectors don't have the same labor intensity. They don't have the same capital intensity. They don't have the same energy intensity, and not the same propensity to import and export. So a transfer of activities doesn't have the same effect on GDP, which is the sum of consumption, that is to say labor, investment, and the balance trade. So why a neo-Keynesian model? For most variation computable general equilibrium model, it is impossible to disconnect GES emissions and GDP, gross domestic product, because of the variation model assumes that there is some perfect flexibility of price, which ensures the balance between supply and demand. That is to say, there is no unsold product, there is no storage. Saving finance investment, and that's a quite important point. The interest rate flexibility ensures the balance between saving and investments. That is to say, money is neutral. We will come back to this point after. So, all incomes are spent either for consumption or investment, because saving finance investment. And the demand is equal to the sum of consumption and investment. Therefore, there is an equality between supply and demand, and there is no risk of overproduction in that kind of approach. So firms don't have any outlets constraints. That's a Jean-Baptiste Say's law. Therefore, the production is maximal. All the available supply factors are used, that is capital, energy, and labor. And so, supply determines the demand. So there is a static equilibrium with full employment, always. GDP is overdetermined by the quantity of available production factors. From this point of view, the valuation neoclassical point of view, a decrease in energy consumption leads to a recession, since energy is a supply factor. So as an example, in that kind of approach, a carbon tax will lead to a recession. For a given amount of saving, there is a crowding effect, un effet d'éviction in French, a crowding effect between investments. A carbon tax has a social cost, which is called a dead weight loss. Excuse me. So the substitution between energy and capital causes an increase in production costs, a decrease in profit, hence a decrease in saving, because profit is a part of saving, and therefore a decrease in global investment. The dead weight loss may be offset by a recycling of the tax receipts for reducing other distortive taxes, as an example, the labor costs, and a decrease in energy imports. But as the imports of the one are the export of the other, there is always a global loss in that kind of model, which is shown on this figure. I put a tax over the price here, and you see that the demand will shift, will decrease, and there will be a recession. We don't have chosen this approach. We have chosen to another approach, a neo-Keynesian one, where there is a supply-demand dynamic. And we can show that this will conduct to a double dividend, ecologic and economic dividend. So theoretically, in an oligopolistic world with imperfect information, firms maximize their profits by adjusting quantities instead prices. So there is no perfect flexibility of prices. In the real world, investment is not only financed by saving, but also by loans. That is to say, money creation. The money amount is not exogenous in that kind of model. So interest rate doesn't balance saving and investment, but the demand and supply of money. And we will see that the crowding effect in that kind of model is very limited. The credit supply depends on investment, rentability, profitability, which is a function of demand. Okay? Since saving doesn't finance investment, saving is a kind of loss. Okay? So there is an outlet constraint. Therefore, in a neo-Keynesian model, the supply depends on demand, not the contrary. And in that kind of model, there are some possible cumulative disequilibrium. There are some involuntary unemployment, and we will see that the state intervention in that kind of model is justified. As an example, an increase in investment financed by money creation leads to an increase in economic activity and jobs creation. The dead weight loss may be offset by not only a reduction of the labor costs, not only a decrease in energy imports, but also by an increase in investment and a capital stock expansion. There is a dynamic because the demand curve here, thanks to the growth of investment, will shift in the right of this figure. And you can see that in that case, production will grow. Okay? And on the labor market, there will be an increase in labor demand and an increase in job creation. So, in that kind of model, we can show that a green growth may exist. So, ThreeME is a supply and demand model. There is an interaction between supply and demand. Investments are not only financed by saving, but also banking loans. So the capital amount is not determined. The crowding effect is limited. The increase in energy efficiency investments as an example, in dwellings doesn't lead to a same decrease in other household spendings, like in a valuation model, the decrease in consumption is equal to the debt annuities less the energy bill reduction. And that's a big difference, because the debt annuities is the amount of the debt divided by the life expectancy of your loan. Okay? So investment depends on anticipated profitability and hence on the demand level. In return, the supply and employment level depend on investment. Jobs creation then retract on demand, consumption and investment. So a green growth is possible. One can show the double dividend existence. As an example, an increase in investment in energy efficiency leads to an increase in global investment because there is a limited crowding effect. The increase in global investment will generate a growth in employment and consumption. So the demand is influenced by supply, which leads in return to an increase in production. Supply is boosted by the demand. You have a cumulative effect. And so there is a decrease in involuntary unemployment. So I will present you the general structure of the ThreeME model. I will show you up. Oops. Pardon. So consumption, intermediary consumption and investment define the domestic demand plus export. It will define the domestic production. Then firms will choose between supply factors, capital, labor, energy and materials. The production generates some incomes which are spent for financing the demand. So demand are always equal to supply, but in a valuation model there is a perfect flexibility of price and quantity with exogenous money supply, that is to say that supply defines the demand. In a Keynesian approach, there is a slow adjustment of price and quantities. There is some money creation. So the demand defines the supply. And it's quite different. So the main behavioral equations. There is a markup, that is to say that firms apply a markup on unit production costs. Wages don't balance labor and labor supply and demand supply. Wages are driven by price inflation, productivity, and unemployment. We will see that after. The real interest rates are fixed by a Taylor rule, and je vais accélérer parce que. So a markup is a simple theory. The prices, which is determined by the firms, are equal to the unitary cost of production plus a margin. And this margin is endogenous. It will depend between the gap. It will depend on the gap between the level of the actual demand and the previous demand. And there is an adjustment, but it's not very important. The wage equation. So the wage depends on inflation. When there are some inflation, the workers ask for bigger salaries. It depends on the labor productivity. It depends on the level of unemployment and the variation of the unemployment level. if this coefficient is not equal to 0, this is a Phillips curve, and this, if this coefficient is equal to 0, we have a wedge setting curve. We will see after the different impacts on the GDP. The interest rate doesn't balance supply and saving, but is determined by a Taylor rule. That is to say that it is fixed by the central bank. It depends on inflation and variation of unemployment. Inflation and variation of unemployment. I have already explained that to you. So there is some money creation. The capital element is endogenous. So the eviction effect is limited. So as an example, when you increase the public investment by 1% of the GDP, you will have first an expansion due to the investment multiplicator, this dynamic effect between supply and demand. And then you begin to reimburse your debt, so there will be a decrease of the GDP expansion, and in the long term you will have small benefits. I will not get through the details, but it is I have printed this figure to show you that our results are quite similar to the results we obtain by using a quarterly model of economic prevision like Mésange in France. Attendez, ah oui, non, oh là là. A permanent 10% increase of oil and gas prices comparison with Mésange. You can see that we have comparable results between ThreeME and Mésange in the short and long term. Okay. So we think that our model is well calibrated. If you assume that there is a wage setting, that is to say that the wages depend on the variation of unemployment, not the level of unemployment, you will have an increase in GDP even in the long term. Okay. Whereas if you choose a Phillips curve, you can see that the level of the GDP in the long term is not good, because we assume that the level of unemployment in the first date of the simulation is a level of voluntary unemployment. Okay, so if you think that the actual level of unemployment in France is not voluntary, you have to choose this assumption. Okay. So hybridization on an example scenario. We have developed several hybrid modeling for different sector uses. That is to say that the energy consumption doesn't depend on revenues. It's not because we are rich that we will consume 3 times more energy to warm our building, as an example. So in that kind of hybrid model, the flux defines the stock evolution, and the stock determines the energy consumption. So there is an hybridization between bottom-up and top-down approaches. As an example, we have represented the housing stock across 7 energy classes. We have represented the vehicle stock, which is split into 7 energy classes. So, and of course, there are several energy technologies. Ten minutes, okay. So in our model, there is a dynamic in the stock buildings. There is some new construction, but there is also a shift between energy classes because people will invest in energy efficiency if the prices of energy is increasing. Up, I will go faster. So, households split their income between expenses and saving. Expenses are shared between housing and transportation and other expenses. And as an example, the housing spending will be shared between new housing construction, existing housing retrofit, and energy consumption. And energy consumption is defined by the nature of building stock evolution. So agents face several energy-related trade-offs. Firms' investments are impacted by the trade-off between capital and energy. So there is a substitution between capital and energy when the relative price of energy increases. There is a possible substitution between energy sources, and there is an endogenous technical progress in our model. Households choose between energy-intensive and energy-efficient investment, both in building and in transportation. And also there is a sobriety effects. There is some energy sufficiency when energy prices increase. As an example, households reduce heating and gasoline expenditure when energy prices increase. So, I will talk about the Adams scenario of energy transition. So the results are estimated as deviations from a baseline scenario. The feature of this reference scenario, the energy mix evolves as provisioned by current law. The existing instruments of climate change mitigation are maintained unmodified. That is to say that there is a tax credit on energy efficiency in building. There are some subsidies in transportation. The domestic taxes are maintained unmodified, etc. We assume that the GDP growth will be equal to 1.6% each year by 2035. That is the sum of the productivity gains and the demographic growth. The fossil fuel prices follow IEA forecast. The reference scenario only serves as a counterfactual. Its stability allows identifying the impacts of the scenario's implementation. So, estimation the macroeconomic impacts of the energy transition. We assume that the coal and fuel electric plants will be closed in 2030. Energy demand is reduced by a factor 2 in 2050. CO2 emissions will be cut by 75% compared with the level in 1990. So there is 3 versions of the scenario, differing by the share of nuclear power in the electric mix by 2050. 18%, 25%, or 50%. This scenario is quite compatible with the actual law of energy transition in France. So here is the mix, the energy mix in the reference scenario. Okay. And then here is the mix of the energy transition scenario with yes, here is a 0 share of nuclear power plant in the mix. That's the new version of the ADEME scenario. Most interesting for the debate. Okay. And we can see that in a neo-Keynesian approach, there is a GDP gains. That is to say that in that period, the GDP in the energy transition scenario will be higher by 4% than the reference scenario. Okay? So why? Because investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency will boost GDP. There will be some job creation, so more consumption and more growth. And that is possible because the energy bill reduction will offset the price of energy efficiency investment. Okay? So you can see that there is a growth of consumption, a growth of investment, a growth in trade balance, because we don't import fossil fuels anymore. The unemployment rate will decrease by 3.6 of the labor population. Real wage will grow because when unemployment decreases, there are increase in real wages. And there is a decrease in public deficits. And you can verify that there is a factor 4 reduction in GWS emissions. I am over. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, there is. Yes, Roland Sabot from CA Cadarache. There is a question about validation of the model. We have in the past various examples of energy shock. Yes. There is the two oil shock in the 70s and the beginning of 80s, and there is the counter oil shock. Have you tested your model against these events?
Yes. Yes, yes. That's why I presented you this this figure to show you that our model can reproduce the GDP impact of an increase in oil and gas prices as a predictive model of economic conjunctures.
Yes, but what I'm asking is on the past.
Yes, on the past, yes, but you can see that there is a 0.2 reduction in GDP when there is an increase in 10% oil prices. So if there is an increase in 100% of the oil prices, like in 1979, you will have a reduction of the GDP growth in comparison of a reference scenario by 2 points of GDP. Yes, but it's not only because of an increase in oil price. There was a reduction in labor productivity, a great reduction of labor productivity, because we have developed the Fordism as a maximal that we could do, and this explains the global reduction of economic growth in the world. There was some monetary and budgetary policy of restrictive budgetary policies. There are a lot of factors, not only the yes, yeah, we did that.
What I was surprised to hear here was that you didn't say anything about the risk of just pumping in money and getting like a lot of inflation. I mean, Keynes isn't very popular these days, as you know. I mean, he has fallen out of popularity because his very simple assumption that you could solve the problems on the supply side by just increasing the demand artificially by pumping in money, that didn't really help. So we got stagflation, we got at the same time inflation and unemployment. So what do you have to say about
Yes. If you read the figure I show you, there is a lot of inflation.
Yeah.
But a lot of inflation. 10%, the price will be higher than 10% than the reference scenario, but in 15 years. So that is to say that there will be 0.1% of inflation. That's not so much. And there is two kinds of inflation. Inflation generated by the supply side, that is to say, a growing in cost of production, and inflation which is generated by an increase in demand. Look at that. If I increase the demand thanks to a public spending expansion, you will have a shift from this demand curve to the right. So you can see that there is an increasing in price, okay, inflation, but in parallel you have an increase in GDP. If the wages are indexed on inflation, there is no reduction in the level of life, your purchase capacity. Okay, so that's a dynamic which which run in the no, but there is a constraint. That is to say, if the inflation is much higher than the rest of the world, you can have a loss in competitiveness, and it will reduce your trade balance. That's the negative rebound effect of inflation, but it is taken into account. Yeah.
So we are going to try to take 3 more questions.
Well, I wanted to know what prevents borrowing from
There is a limit, which is the Taylor rule. If there is an expansion of capital, okay, there will be inflation because there will be a growth in GDP. And central bank doesn't like inflation at all. So they will increase the interest rate, and there will be the central bank, yes, and this will lead to a crowding effect. Mhm. Don't really know. Yes. Yes. Yes, sure. Shall I develop?
If you can answer shortly.
No, not shortly, but
We'll have the last question. Gregor, please.
oh, okay. Okay. So 2 questions. The production function is, I've not talked about that because it's quite common to all kind of models. It's a CES function, constant elasticity of substitution function. You know what I mean? Ah, the level of production is determined by the demand. But you have to implement a production function in the model because the firms must choose between the supply factors, energy, labor, and capital. And there is a substitution, a possible substitution between energy and capital, which is determined by the gap between prices of the factors, and there are some constant elasticity of substitution. I have a slide on this in the annex of the, but I don't have any time to present you now, I think. And the second question, yes, the revolve effects of the growth, economic growth, on the energy demand. It is taken into account. That's why of the quality of a macroeconomic model. It is to take into account the acting effects. You know what I mean? Excuse my English. Okay.
Thank our speaker once again.
Thank you.